In the America of the early 20th century, the law did not protect everyone equally. Classrooms were divided by race. Water fountains bore silent commands. Courtrooms, those marble temples of justice, often enforced separation rather than fairness. Under Jim Crow, the Constitution promised liberty, but the fine print was written in fear. It was an era when change usually arrived through marches, boycotts, and sometimes blood. Yet in the background, far from the chanting crowds and flashing cameras, another kind of battle was being fought. A quieter one. Inside dim courtrooms, before judges who had never questioned segregation, the future of the nation was argued, sentence by sentence. This story does not begin with a fiery orator or a charismatic preacher. It begins with a lawyer who rarely raised his voice. Thurgood Marshall did not believe the law was noble. He believed it was powerful. And power, when understood, could be redirected. He knew courts were not moral institutions. They were human ones, shaped by precedent, pressure, and persistence. So he learned their language. He mastered their rules. And he used the system that oppressed millions to slowly dismantle itself. Night after night, he traveled the back roads of the segregated South, defending clients no one else would represent, risking his life not for applause, but for precedent. He was not chasing history. He was building it, brick by legal brick. Long before the civil rights movement had a name, before it had leaders carved into monuments, one man was quietly laying its foundation inside the law books of the United States. This is the story of how America changed, not with a gunshot, but with an argument. If you're drawn to the quiet forces that shape history, the forgotten architects behind the headlines, consider subscribing to this channel. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and join us as we explore the stories that changed the world, one courtroom at a time. Chapter 1. Born into Segregation. Thurgood Marshall was born on July 2nd, 1908, into a city that practiced separation as a daily ritual. Baltimore, Maryland, sat uneasily between North and South. It was not bound by plantation memory, yet it enforced racial boundaries with quiet efficiency. Streetcars, schools, neighborhoods, and courtrooms all carried the same unspoken rule: know your place. Marshall grew up in a working-class black family where survival depended on attentiveness to people, to tone, to rules. His father, William Marshall, worked as a porter for the railroad. He was not a lawyer, but he had a habit that would shape his son's life. In the evenings, he told stories of court cases he read about in the newspaper. He reenacted arguments, mocked judges, questioned verdicts. Young Thurgood listened from the corner of the room, absorbing the rhythm of legal reasoning before he understood its vocabulary. Those stories planted an early lesson. The law was not distant or sacred. It was human, and humans could be wrong. School reinforced a harsher truth. Marshall attended segregated classrooms with worn books and limited resources, while white schools across town received new materials and attention. The inequality was visible, measurable, and unchallenged. He learned early that injustice rarely announced itself loudly. It simply normalized unfairness until it felt permanent. Marshall was not a quiet child. He questioned teachers, challenged authority, and argued constantly, traits that earned him punishment rather than praise. At one school, he was forced to memorize sections of the US Constitution as discipline. The irony was not lost on him later. While being punished under segregation, he was memorizing the very document that promised equal protection under the law. Baltimore also showed him something else: fear. Black residents understood how fragile safety could be. A wrong look, a misplaced word, an accusation in the wrong courtroom could end a life. In this world, the law was not an abstraction discussed in textbooks. It was a force that could imprison, protect, or destroy. For Thurgood Marshall, law became a language of power long before it became a profession. It was the grammar of survival, spoken fluently by those who ruled, barely taught to those who suffered. He did not grow up dreaming of justice as an ideal. He grew up understanding it as a necessity. Long before he stood before the Supreme Court, Marshall learned his first lesson in a segregated city. If the law could be used against you, it could also be learned, studied, challenged, and eventually turned in your favor. Chapter 2. A young man who questioned authority. When Thurgood Marshall arrived at Lincoln University in the late 1920s, he did not arrive as a future justice of the Supreme Court. He arrived as a restless young man, more interested in conversation than compliance, more comfortable in argument than in silence. Lincoln, one of the nation's oldest historically black universities, had long been a place where ideas were sharpened, but Marshall tested its limits daily. He was, by most academic standards, an unremarkable student. His grades were uneven, his attendance unreliable. What he lacked in discipline, however, he made up for in presence. Marshall argued constantly about politics, about fairness, about rules that seemed designed to be obeyed rather than examined. Professors often found him difficult. Administrators found him loud. Authority, to Marshall, was something to be questioned, not accepted. His debating skills were not polished, but they were instinctive. He listened carefully, interrupted boldly, and refused to retreat once he believed he was right. These traits frequently earned him punishment. On more than one occasion, Marshall was disciplined for talking back, for challenging professors in class, for refusing to let an argument rest. Yet even in reprimand, a pattern was forming. He was learning how ideas collided, how logic could corner power, and how persistence could wear it down. Outside the classroom, Lincoln exposed Marshall to a broader black intellectual tradition. Students debated race, law, colonialism, and the meaning of citizenship in a country that denied them full belonging. This was not abstract theory. Many of these young men would graduate into a world where their education did not shield them from humiliation or violence. The gap between American ideals and American reality was discussed openly and relentlessly. It was here that Marshall began to understand something essential. Anger alone changed nothing. Argument, when carefully constructed, could. He saw how the strongest voices were not always the loudest, but the most precise. Language, when used well, could pressure authority without provoking it, could expose contradictions rather than inflame them. By the time Marshall left Lincoln University, he was still far from disciplined, but he had discovered his natural terrain. He did not belong to obedience. He belonged to contest. The law had not yet claimed him, but the instinct was already there. In a country governed by rules, the most dangerous person was not the one who broke them, but the one who understood them well enough to ask, calmly and relentlessly. Why? Chapter 3. Howard Law School. Forged by Charles Hamilton Houston. When Thurgood Marshall entered Howard University's School of Law in the early 1930s, he did not yet see himself as a revolutionary. He saw law school as a practical step, perhaps a way to secure stability in a country that offered black men very little of it. What he did not know was that he was about to be reshaped by a man who believed the law could be used as a surgical weapon against segregation itself. Charles Hamilton Houston was the dean of Howard Law School, and later would be called the man who killed Jim Crow. He did not teach law as theory. He taught it as combat. To Houston, every statute, every precedent, every footnote was either a shield or a blade. And his students were not scholars in training. They were soldiers. The discipline was relentless. Classes were demanding, unforgiving, and deliberately harsh. Houston failed students without hesitation. He told them plainly that mediocrity in a black lawyer was not neutral. It was dangerous. A mistake in court could cost a client not just a case, but freedom, dignity, or life itself. Under Jim Crow, Houston reminded them, there would be no margin for error. Marshall thrived under this pressure. The undisciplined debater from Lincoln University began to change. His arguments sharpened. His instincts became structured. Houston forced him to abandon emotional appeals and replace them with precision. Feelings did not overturn segregation. Strategy did. At Howard, Marshall was trained to see the law as an interconnected system. Segregation, Houston argued, did not survive because it was just. It survived because it was legally protected. The target was clear. Plessy v. Ferguson, the 1896 Supreme Court decision that legalized separate but equal. But Houston understood that such a ruling could not be attacked head-on. Not yet. It had to be weakened, case by case, from the inside. Marshall absorbed this lesson deeply. He learned how to identify unequal facilities, unequal funding, unequal enforcement. He learned to build cases that forced judges to confront facts rather than ideology. If the law claimed equality, then inequality would be measured, documented, and presented without anger, only evidence. This training transformed Marshall's temperament. He was still confident, still stubborn, but now controlled. Houston had given him more than legal knowledge. He had given him a mission and a method. By the time Marshall graduated first in his class in 1933, he was no longer merely questioning authority. He was prepared to challenge it systematically. Howard Law School did not teach him to dream about justice. It taught him how to force the law to live up to its own words. And once Marshall stepped outside those classroom walls, he would carry Houston's lesson with him into every courtroom he entered. Segregation could not survive scrutiny if someone was willing to apply it, patiently, relentlessly, and without fear. Chapter 4. The NAACP's Most Dangerous Job. When Thurgood Marshall accepted a position with the NAACP in the mid-1930s, he did not step into an office of quiet paperwork. He stepped onto a battlefield. The assignment was simple in description and perilous in reality. Travel through the segregated South and challenge Jim Crow in local courts, places where the law often served prejudice, not justice. Marshall became what colleagues quietly called a field lawyer. He drove long distances on back roads, often alone, carrying case files and a keen awareness of where he could not safely stop. Hotels refused him. Restaurants turned him away. In many towns, even the courthouse, his place of work, was hostile territory. Local courtrooms were saturated with resentment. Judges were elected by white constituencies who expected the racial order to remain undisturbed. Prosecutors treated Marshall not as an officer of the court, but as an intruder. Jurors were all white. Sheriffs watched closely, sometimes with hands resting on their weapons. Justice, when it arrived at all, came reluctantly. The danger was not abstract. Marshall was followed, threatened, and harassed repeatedly. In one small town, after successfully defending a black client, a mob gathered outside the courthouse. Word reached Marshall that he was not safe, that a lynching was being discussed openly. He escaped only because a local sheriff, bound more by procedure than sympathy, helped him leave town before nightfall. These were not isolated moments. Every trip carried risk. Marshall learned to read rooms quickly, to speak firmly but never provocatively, to argue the law without inflaming emotion. His safety depended on it. Yet he refused to retreat. Each case, no matter how small, mattered. A teacher paid less than her white counterpart. A black student denied access to a graduate school. A defendant tried before a jury that never saw him as equal. These injustices formed a pattern, and Marshall was mapping it. What sustained him was strategy. He was not trying to win every case. He was building a record. Each ruling, each appeal, each documented inequality moved the larger campaign forward. The NAACP's legal effort was not a sprint toward moral clarity. It was a slow, methodical dismantling of a system fortified by decades of precedent. At night, after courtrooms emptied and doors locked, Marshall reviewed his notes alone. He understood that the law was hostile, but it was also vulnerable. If forced to confront its own contradictions, it could be compelled to change. This was the most dangerous job in America for a black lawyer, not because of the cases themselves, but because of where they were fought. And still, Marshall returned to the road, again and again. He did not seek courage. He practiced it, quietly, consistently, one courthouse at a time. Chapter 5. Winning the Unwinnable Cases. In the segregated South, most of Thurgood Marshall's cases were never meant to be won, at least not in the courtroom where they were first heard. Local judges, bound by custom and pressure, rarely ruled against segregation. Juries were predictable. Outcomes were often decided before arguments began. Marshall understood this reality, and instead of resisting it, he learned how to use it. These were not headline-making trials. They involved unequal teacher salaries, admissions denied to black students, facilities that claimed equality but delivered neglect. On the surface, they appeared small, technical, even tedious. But Marshall and the NAACP understood their strategic value. Each case was a brick. Alone, insignificant. Together, transformative. Marshall learned to frame arguments not for the courtroom in front of him, but for the courts that came after. He created records meticulously. He documented disparities with numbers, photographs, and testimony that left little room for denial. When judges ruled against him, as they often did, those rulings became evidence themselves, proof that the promise of separate but equal was collapsing under scrutiny. This approach required patience and a rare kind of discipline. Losing cases publicly was emotionally taxing. Communities placed their hopes in Marshall, expecting immediate relief from injustice. Explaining that a loss could be a step forward demanded trust. Marshall spoke plainly. He never romanticized the process. Change, he told them, would come slowly, through appeals, not applause. In these years, Marshall refined a crucial skill: knowing when defeat was useful. A loss in a hostile court could expose the system's bias. An appeal could carry that exposure to higher courts, where precedent mattered more than local politics. In this way, failure became part of the design. He also learned restraint. Emotional arguments might sway sympathetic audiences, but they hardened resistance in unfriendly rooms. Marshall kept his tone steady, his language precise. He forced courts to confront facts rather than feelings. Inequality, when measured and repeated across cases, became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Over time, patterns emerged. Courts began to acknowledge disparities in funding, facilities, and opportunity. They issued narrow rulings, careful, limited, but each chipped away at the legal foundation of segregation. The law, confronted repeatedly with its own contradictions, began to hesitate. Marshall's victories were rarely celebrated in the moment. There were no parades for a favorable appellate ruling on teacher pay. Yet these decisions quietly accumulated, reshaping the legal landscape. By the early 1950s, the structure that had upheld segregation for decades was no longer solid. It was brittle. Marshall had learned something essential. History is rarely overturned in a single moment. It is weakened gradually, case by case, by those willing to endure loss without surrender. What looked like persistence was, in truth, strategy, and what appeared unwinnable was slowly becoming inevitable. Chapter 6: The Road to Brown versus Board of Education. By the early 1950s, Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund were no longer fighting isolated battles. They were advancing along a carefully charted path, one that had been mapped decades earlier in classrooms at Howard Law School and tested in hostile courtrooms across the South. The destination was clear, even if the route remained uncertain: the Supreme Court of the United States. The campaign against segregation in public education was never meant to be sudden. Plessy versus Ferguson had stood for more than half a century, declaring that separation by race was constitutional so long as facilities were equal. Marshall knew the fiction embedded in that phrase. Equality, when enforced through segregation, was always deferred, diluted, or denied. The challenge was proving this not as a moral claim, but as a constitutional one. The NAACP pursued multiple cases simultaneously, each exposing a different fracture in the system. Black students denied admission to graduate and professional schools. Children forced to travel miles past white schools to reach inferior black ones. Districts that offered education in name, but not in substance. These cases built a record that could not be dismissed as anecdotal. Inequality was systematic, measurable, and sustained. What distinguished this phase of the campaign was the introduction of social science. Marshall and his colleagues understood that segregation did more than distribute resources unfairly. It shaped identity. Psychologists and sociologists were brought in to testify about the effects of segregation on black children. Studies showed that enforced separation fostered feelings of inferiority, damaging self-worth long before a child could articulate it. This evidence was controversial. Critics argued that courts should not consider social science. Marshall disagreed. The Constitution, he believed, governed real lives, not abstractions. If the law permitted harm, that harm had to be demonstrated in full. As the cases moved upward through the judicial system, resistance intensified. Southern states closed schools rather than integrate them, Legislatures passed laws to delay compliance. Segregationists framed their opposition as defense of tradition, of local control, of order. Marshall recognized these arguments. They were familiar, rehearsed, and hollow. By 1952, several school segregation cases were consolidated under one name: Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. Marshall stood at the center of the effort, leading the legal team before the Supreme Court. The stakes were immense. A loss would reinforce segregation nationwide. A victory would challenge the legal architecture of American racial hierarchy. The road to Brown had been long by design. Each prior case had weakened the foundation. Each appeal had narrowed the space in which segregation could hide. Now, the law itself was being asked a direct question it had avoided for decades. Could separation ever be equal? The answer would not come easily. But for the first time, the Supreme Court could not look away. The evidence was assembled. The arguments were disciplined. The contradictions were undeniable. And the quiet lawyer who had spent years building this moment was ready to ask the law to confront its own reflection. Chapter 7. Brown v. Board. The day the law blinked. The courtroom of the Supreme Court of the United States was silent in a way few rooms ever are. Heavy curtains muted the outside world. Marble columns stood unmoving, indifferent to the weight of history gathering inside. On the bench sat 9 justices, guardians of precedent, tradition, and restraint. Before them stood Thurgood Marshall, carrying not a speech of outrage, but a record of facts assembled over decades. Marshall did not argue as a crusader, he argued as a technician. His voice was steady, his language deliberate. He spoke not of hatred, but of harm. Not of ideology, but of evidence. Segregation, he explained, was not a neutral arrangement. It imposed inequality, even when buildings and books appeared similar. It shaped opportunity, expectation, and identity from the earliest years of life. The justices listened closely. They questioned the reach of the Constitution, the meaning of the 14th Amendment, the relevance of social science. Could the court overturn Plessy v. Ferguson without destabilizing the law itself? Could it declare that something long accepted was, in fact, wrong? Marshall did not press for moral reckoning. He pressed for consistency. If the Constitution promised equal protection, then separation enforced by law could not stand. The evidence left little room for compromise. Equality delayed was equality denied. Behind the scenes, the court struggled. The justices were divided, uncertain, aware that any decision would reshape the nation. Chief Justice Earl Warren worked quietly to build consensus, understanding that a fractured ruling would invite defiance. Months passed. The courtroom emptied. The country waited. On May 17, 1954, the court delivered its decision. In a unanimous opinion, the Supreme Court declared that segregation in public education was unconstitutional. Separate educational facilities, the court ruled, were inherently unequal. With those words, Plessy v. Ferguson was undone. Not entirely erased, but stripped of its authority where it mattered most. The reaction was immediate and uneven. In some communities, the decision was greeted with cautious hope. In others, it was met with anger and resistance. Southern officials vowed to resist integration by any means available. Schools closed. Laws were rewritten. The ruling, while decisive, did not bring instant change. But the law had shifted. For the first time, the Supreme Court had openly acknowledged that segregation itself violated the Constitution. It was a rare moment of institutional humility, a recognition that precedent could perpetuate injustice. The law had blinked. For Marshall, the victory was restrained. There was no celebration in the courtroom. He understood the distance between a ruling and its implementation. Courts could declare rights. They could not enforce belief. The struggle would continue, now on new ground. Yet something irreversible had occurred. The legal foundation of segregation had cracked. The decision in Brown v. Board of Education did not complete the civil rights movement, but it made it possible. In that quiet courtroom, without fanfare or force, the law finally admitted it had been wrong. Chapter 8. Victory without celebration. The decision in Brown v. Board of Education was supposed to be a turning point. On paper, segregation in public schools was over. In reality, it was only the beginning of a more complicated struggle. The law had spoken, but the country had not yet listened. Across much of the South, resistance formed almost immediately. Governors denounced the ruling. Legislatures passed new laws designed to delay or undermine integration. Some school districts chose closure over compliance, locking doors rather than admitting black children. The phrase, massive resistance, entered the national vocabulary, describing a coordinated effort to preserve segregation through legal maneuvering and open defiance. Marshall watched these developments without surprise. He had never believed that a court decision could, by itself, change social behavior. Brown altered the legal landscape, but it did not dismantle fear, habit, or hatred. Those forces were not written into law, and they could not be removed by judicial decree. The gap between principle and practice was painful. Families who believed the ruling would bring immediate relief instead encountered threats, violence, and isolation. Children walked into newly integrated schools under the protection of federal troops. Communities fractured. Integration, where it occurred, came slowly and at great personal cost. Marshall often repeated a sobering truth. Brown didn't integrate schools. People did. The ruling created the possibility of change. Courage made it real. Teachers who accepted new students, parents who sent their children into hostile environments, judges and federal officials who enforced the law despite local opposition. Progress depended not on the elegance of a decision, but on the willingness to act on it. For Marshall, this period clarified the limits of law. Legal victories could open doors, but they could not compel society to walk through them. Courts could declare equality, but they could not manufacture acceptance. The work of integration required sustained effort, legal, political, and personal. Still, the absence of celebration did not mean the absence of progress. Brown became a foundation for future civil rights legislation, for desegregation beyond schools, for a broader re-examination of equality under the Constitution. The ruling was cited, expanded, and enforced over time, even as resistance persisted. Marshall understood that history rarely moves in straight lines. Victories are often followed by backlash. Change provokes fear before it inspires understanding. The law had won an essential battle, but the larger war for equality was far from over. In the quiet after the decision, Marshall did not rest. He returned to work, aware that the most difficult phase had begun. The law had taken a stand. Now society would have to decide whether it was willing to follow. Chapter 9. From Advocate to Judge. For most of his career, Thurgood Marshall had stood outside the system, pressing against it, exposing its contradictions and forcing it to change. Now, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he was invited to step inside. It was a transition that carried both honor and risk. To enter the judiciary meant enforcing laws he had once challenged and trusting institutions that had rarely trusted him. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy appointed Marshall to the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. The nomination itself was controversial. Southern senators resisted openly, questioning his qualifications while quietly objecting to his record on civil rights. His confirmation was delayed for months, stalled by procedural tactics designed to signal that his presence was unwelcome. Marshall endured the hearings with patience. He did not soften his record. He did not apologize for the cases he had argued or the precedents he had helped overturn. He presented himself as he always had, direct, factual, and grounded in the law. When the Senate finally confirmed him, it was not a triumph. It was an acceptance hard-won. 2 years later, in 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed Marshall as Solicitor General of the United States. The role made him the federal government's chief advocate before the Supreme Court, the very courtroom where he had spent years challenging the government's failures. It was an extraordinary reversal. The lawyer who once argued against state power now spoke for it. Again, opposition followed. Senators questioned whether a civil rights lawyer could represent the nation impartially. Some framed their concerns in procedural language. Others dispensed with subtlety. Marshall understood the subtext. The objection was not to his competence, but to what he symbolized. As Solicitor General, Marshall argued dozens of cases before the Supreme Court. His style remained unchanged. He avoided theatrics. He focused on clarity. He treated the law as a living system that required coherence, not nostalgia. His success rate was high, among the highest of any Solicitor General, quietly reinforcing what his critics refused to acknowledge. For Marshall, these roles marked a profound shift. He was no longer only dismantling unjust laws, he was now responsible for defending the legal framework of the nation. The transition demanded restraint. It required him to distinguish between personal belief and institutional duty. He managed this balance carefully, guided by the same principle that had shaped his career. The law mattered because it governed real lives. Entering the system did not change Marshall's mission, it refined it. He understood that lasting change required more than protest from the outside. It required presence within. By taking his place on the bench and behind the government's lectern, Marshall carried the lessons of struggle into the heart of American law, where they could no longer be ignored. Chapter 10. The First Black Justice. In the summer of 1967, President Lyndon B. Johnson made a decision he considered long overdue. He nominated Thurgood Marshall to serve as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. For Johnson, the appointment was personal as well as political. He later said it was the right thing to do, the right time to do it, the right man, and the right place. For the nation, it marked a rupture with history. Marshall's nomination was unprecedented. In nearly 2 centuries, no Black American had ever sat on the Supreme Court. The building itself, its rituals, its traditions, its authority, had been shaped entirely without their presence. Marshall was being asked not only to join the court, but to change what it represented. The confirmation process was difficult and openly hostile. Senators questioned Marshall for weeks, probing his past cases, his views on race, crime, and constitutional interpretation. Some inquiries bordered on interrogation. Others barely concealed their resentment. Marshall responded with calm precision. He refused to perform gratitude or defensiveness. He answered as a judge would, measured, careful, grounded in precedent. When the Senate finally confirmed him, Marshall became the first black justice in American history. The moment was historic, but restrained. There were no celebrations in the courtroom, no acknowledgement from the bench. Tradition demanded neutrality. Yet the weight of the moment was unmistakable. On his first day, Marshall took his seat beneath the inscription, "Equal justice under law." He was acutely aware of the irony. For most of his life, that promise had been selectively applied. Now, he was one of its guardians. The burden he carried was dual. Symbolically, he represented a breach in a wall that had excluded generations. Practically, he was one vote among 9, expected to interpret the Constitution, not embody it. Marshall resisted being reduced to a symbol. He insisted on being judged by the rigor of his reasoning, not the novelty of his presence. Inside the court, he brought a perspective shaped by experience rather than abstraction. He understood how laws were enforced on the ground, how they affected those without power or voice. This did not make him sentimental, it made him precise. He questioned assumptions others took for granted. He reminded the court that legal doctrine did not exist in a vacuum. Marshall's appointment did not transform the court overnight. Decisions remained contested, ideological divides persisted, but something fundamental had changed. The highest court in the land now included a justice who had argued cases in hostile southern courtrooms, who had seen the consequences of legal indifference firsthand. In 1967, the Supreme Court did not simply gain a new member, it gained a memory. And with Thurgood Marshall seated on the bench, the law was no longer able to forget the people it governed. Chapter 11. A Justice Who Never Forgot the Streets. Thurgood Marshall arrived at the Supreme Court with credentials few could challenge, yet his approach to judging set him apart almost immediately. He was not drawn to elegant theories or abstract constitutional puzzles. His method was grounded, practical, and unmistakably shaped by experience. Where others began with doctrine, Marshall began with consequences. In conference and on the bench, he often asked a simple question: what will this decision do to people who have no power? It was not a rhetorical gesture. For Marshall, the law was inseparable from daily life. He had seen how statutes were enforced in small southern towns, how discretion could become cruelty, how rights could vanish once a courtroom emptied. His opinions reflected this perspective. Marshall wrote plainly, avoiding ornamental language. He favored clarity over cleverness, reality over refinement. Critics sometimes described him as unsophisticated, but the assessment missed the point. Marshall was not uninterested in legal theory. He was wary of theory detached from human impact. He paid particular attention to cases involving criminal procedure, voting rights, education, and access to justice. He understood that the justice system did not operate evenly. Police power, prosecutorial discretion, and judicial interpretation affected the poor and marginalized most sharply. In these cases, Marshall's voice was steady and persistent, reminding the court that constitutional protections were meant to be lived, not merely recited. Unlike many of his colleagues, Marshall had represented clients who stood alone before the state. He had sat beside defendants who expected nothing from the law but punishment. This experience shaped his skepticism toward unchecked authority. He did not assume fairness. He demanded proof of it. Marshall was also deeply attentive during oral arguments. He listened carefully, often interrupting lawyers to ask how a rule would function outside the courtroom. How would it affect a tenant who could not afford counsel? A defendant questioned without understanding his rights? A child in a school system designed to exclude? He was not hostile. He was precise. And he rarely forgot an answer. This grounded style sometimes placed him at odds with colleagues who preferred broader principles or historical abstraction. Marshall accepted these differences without resentment. He did not seek dominance within the court. He sought fidelity to the Constitution as it affected real lives. In this way, Marshall served as more than a justice. He was a witness. He carried into the marble halls of the Supreme Court the memory of segregated classrooms, hostile juries, and unequal enforcement. He ensured that these realities were not erased by legal elegance. Even as decades passed, Marshall never forgot the streets where injustice first taught him the meaning of law. From the bench, he spoke quietly, persistently, for those who were rarely heard, anchoring constitutional interpretation to the world it governed. Chapter 12. Dissent as Moral Memory. As the Supreme Court shifted in the 1970s and 1980s, Thurgood Marshall increasingly found himself in the minority. The court grew more conservative, less willing to expand civil rights, more inclined to limit the reach of earlier victories. Decisions narrowed protections Marshall had spent a lifetime building. Where once the law had opened doors, it now hesitated, or quietly stepped back. Marshall responded not with retreat, but with dissent. His dissents were not expressions of frustration. They were records, carefully written, deliberately detailed. They preserved an alternative understanding of the Constitution, one rooted in lived experience rather than abstract restraint. Marshall knew dissents did not change outcomes immediately. Their power lay elsewhere. He often wrote as if addressing readers not yet born. In cases involving the death penalty, Marshall's opposition was unwavering. He argued that capital punishment was administered arbitrarily and disproportionately against the poor and people of color. He did not claim moral superiority. He presented evidence, statistics, patterns, human cost. Over time, his dissents formed a sustained indictment of a system he believed could not be made fair. When the court limited voting rights protections, restricted remedies for discrimination, or expanded police power at the expense of individual liberty, Marshall dissented again. His language remained measured but firm. He did not accuse his colleagues of malice. He accused the law of forgetting its purpose. Marshall understood that the Constitution was not self-enforcing. Its meaning depended on interpretation, and interpretation reflected values. When the majority chose caution over protection, Marshall chose memory. He reminded the court of the consequences of neglect, of how easily rights could erode when viewed as optional rather than essential. In conference, he was known to speak plainly. "You guys don't know what it's like out there," he once told his colleagues. The remark was not a rebuke. It was a statement of fact. Marshall had seen the distance between theory and reality. His dissents closed that distance by recording it. These opinions were not written for applause. They were written to endure. History, Marshall believed, was patient. Courts reversed themselves. Societies reconsidered. Future justices would search old volumes for guidance, and there his words would remain, waiting. In this way, dissent became Marshall's final instrument of influence. When he could no longer shape the law through majority opinions, he shaped its conscience. He left behind a trail of arguments that refused to let injustice be normalized. The majority ruled in the present. Marshall wrote for the future. And in doing so, he ensured that the moral memory of the court, what it once knew, what it once promised, would not be erased. Chapter 13. The court changes. Marshall stands alone. By the mid-1980s, the Supreme Court Thurgood Marshall had joined was no longer the court he had known. Years of new appointments had altered its direction. The expansive vision of civil rights that followed Brown v. Board of Education began to narrow, replaced by a jurisprudence that favored restraint, states' rights, and skepticism toward broad constitutional protections. Marshall felt the shift with each term. Cases he once expected to prevail now ended in close defeats. Protections he had helped secure were reinterpreted, limited, or quietly hollowed out. The language of the court changed as well, less concerned with remedying inequality, more focused on procedural boundaries. For Marshall, this was not merely an intellectual disagreement. It was a retreat from the court's moral responsibility. In conference, he found himself increasingly alone. Colleagues spoke of neutrality and tradition. Marshall spoke of consequences. He reminded them that the Constitution was written to restrain power, not to protect it. These exchanges were respectful but revealing. The law, he believed, was drifting away from the lived reality of the people it governed. Isolation did not silence him. It sharpened his resolve. Marshall continued to dissent, sometimes alone, sometimes with a single ally. His opinions grew more direct, more urgent. He warned that rights were fragile, that progress, once achieved, could be undone by indifference. He rejected the comforting idea that history moved only forward. Behind the scenes, his health declined. Hearing loss made oral arguments difficult. Fatigue followed long days on the bench. Yet Marshall refused to withdraw quietly. He prepared diligently, read extensively, and participated fully. The seat he occupied had been denied to generations. He would not vacate it without purpose. He also understood the weight of presence. As the first black justice, his absence would be felt not just institutionally, but symbolically. Representation, he knew, did not guarantee justice, but its disappearance could erase memory. And memory mattered. When urged to temper his tone, Marshall remained firm. He had not come to the court to be agreeable. He had come to testify. Silence in the face of retreat would have signaled acceptance. He would not offer it. As the court changed around him, Thurgood Marshall stood anchored in the lessons of his life. He had seen how rights were denied, how they were won, and how easily they could be lost again. And even when he stood alone, he continued to speak, ensuring that the conscience of the court, however faintly, was still heard. Chapter 14. The Price of Being First. By the late 1980s, the cost of Thurgood Marshall's long journey was becoming visible. Years of travel, pressure, and unrelenting responsibility had taken a toll on his health. He suffered from heart and kidney problems, endured repeated hospitalizations, and gradually lost much of his hearing. The physical strain was unmistakable, but the deeper exhaustion was less easily seen. Being first carries a burden that cannot be shared. Marshall had spent his life opening doors that were never meant to open. Each role he entered, NAACP lawyer, federal judge, solicitor general, Supreme Court justice, required him to navigate hostility that others did not face. He was constantly watched, constantly measured, expected to represent more than himself, or being judged as only one man. The fatigue was not only physical, it was historical. Marshall carried the weight of expectations from communities who saw in him both progress and protection. He knew that every misstep would be amplified, every failure used to question the legitimacy of his presence. There was little room for rest and none for retreat. Privately, the isolation grew heavier. Many of his closest allies had left the court. New colleagues did not share his memories of segregation, of Brown, of the legal battles that once defined the nation's conscience. Marshall remained engaged, but the sense of standing apart deepened. He was not simply aging within the institution. He was outlasting an era. Yet even as his health declined, Marshall resisted stepping aside. Retirement, he understood, was not a neutral act. His departure would shape the court he left behind. The possibility that his seat might be filled by someone hostile to civil rights weighed heavily on him. Remaining, even in diminished strength, felt like a form of guardianship. The sacrifices extended beyond the bench. Long hours and constant scrutiny strained personal relationships. Public life offered little privacy. Marshall rarely spoke of these costs, but they were real. Progress, he had learned, demanded endurance as much as courage. In these years, Marshall became more reflective. He spoke openly about the fragility of rights and the illusion of permanence. He warned that advances could be undone quietly, without dramatic reversals. His voice, though physically weaker, remained morally steady. The price of being first is often paid in solitude. Marshall bore it without complaint. His career was not a story of uninterrupted triumph, but of sustained commitment under strain. And even as the weight grew heavier, he continued to serve, aware that the path he had cleared would only remain open if someone stayed long enough to guard it. Chapter 15. Retirement of a Reluctant Legend. In 1991, after nearly a quarter century on the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall stepped away from the bench. The decision was shaped by declining health, but it was not made easily. For Marshall, retirement was not an ending, it was a relinquishing of a position he had spent a lifetime earning, and one he understood still mattered deeply. When he announced his departure, the tone was characteristically restrained. There were no victory speeches, no reflections on personal achievement. Marshall had never viewed his career as a series of milestones. He viewed it as unfinished work. The court he left behind was more conservative than the one he had joined, and he worried openly about the future of civil rights protections he believed were fragile. Marshall knew what his retirement would mean. His seat would be filled by a justice with a different philosophy, one less inclined to expand constitutional protections. He did not pretend otherwise. Yet he refused to regret his service. The law, he believed, was shaped over generations, not by any single vote. Even in retirement, Marshall remained a presence. His opinions, especially his dissents, continued to be read, cited, and debated. Law students studied his reasoning. Advocates returned to his arguments when the court reconsidered questions of equality, punishment, and power. His voice, preserved in the law reports, remained part of the conversation. Marshall also spoke candidly about his life's work. He rejected the idea that progress was inevitable. The legal system can force open doors, he often implied, but it cannot make people walk through them. Rights, he warned, required vigilance. Memory mattered. He left the court without surrendering his ideals. Equality under the law was not a chapter he believed could be closed. It was a commitment that demanded renewal. His career had demonstrated how fragile justice could be, and how much persistence it required. When Thurgood Marshall retired, the court lost a justice, but the law retained something more enduring, a framework built through decades of struggle, argument, and witness. He had not merely interpreted the Constitution, he had forced it to confront the lives it governed. Marshall did not seek to be remembered as a legend. He sought to be useful. And long after his departure from the bench, the legal foundations he helped lay continued to shape the nation, quietly, persistently, just as he had. Epilogue. The Constitution finally learned his name. Thurgood Marshall died in January 1993, quietly, as he had lived much of his life. There were no gavels, no courtroom rituals, only the closing of a long chapter in American legal history. He was 84 years old. The nation mourned, but the law remembered. By the time of his death, many of the battles Marshall had fought were written into doctrine. School segregation was unconstitutional. Racial covenants were unenforceable. The federal government had accepted responsibility for protecting civil rights when states refused to do so. These outcomes now felt inevitable to many, but inevitability was an illusion Marshall had spent a lifetime dismantling. His legacy lived most clearly in civil rights law, not as a monument, but as a living structure. Each precedent he helped secure became a support beam for future cases. Lawyers arguing equality rarely needed to invoke his name aloud. They stood on ground he had already stabilized. It is impossible to understand the civil rights movement without understanding Marshall's role within it. Martin Luther King Jr. moved the conscience of a nation. Thurgood Marshall moved its legal machinery. Without courtroom victories, marches could be reversed. Without enforceable rulings, moral clarity could fade. Marshall ensured that justice, once declared, could not be easily undone. He believed the Constitution was not a sacred relic, but a human document, capable of growth, error, and correction. The law, to Marshall, functioned as the moral memory of the nation. It recorded not only what Americans claimed to believe, but what they were willing to enforce, defend, and repeat. In his dissents, in his arguments, and in his relentless insistence on lived reality, Marshall preserved memory against forgetting. He reminded the court of the streets, the schools, the prisons, and the children behind every abstraction. He wrote not for applause, but for endurance. By the end of his life, the Constitution had finally learned his name, not as a footnote, but as a voice woven into its meaning, not as a symbol, but as a witness. History often celebrates those who speak the loudest, but it is shaped just as deeply by those who argue patiently, night after night, case after case, until justice becomes undeniable. If you found value in this quiet journey through law and memory, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts below. Stories like these endure only when they are remembered and passed on.